Welcome to One Dime Radio. Today, I am here with Ed from A New Conversation, a reoccurring guest on the One Dime Radio podcast. He's been here before on various episodes, such as the episode on post-capitalist strategy and inventing the future. I think you've been on a bunch of other episodes too. I've been on your podcast, A New Conversation. Go check that out on YouTube. The link is in the description. And he's been on our exclusive Patreon podcast, which you can check out as well. Today, Ed and I are going to discuss the topic of techno-feudalism, and more broadly, whether we are still in capitalism. Believe it or not, this is a debate that a lot of people are having, and mostly just internet Marxists. But it's been recently popularized by Yanis Varoufakis, the Greek economist, and his talk with Slavoj Žižek. I'll play a clip of that right here.
It's my crazy theory that capitalism has already evolved out of itself. It has been transformed to another system. And the reason why I say that is because, for me, capitalism requires two things. Firstly, profit to drive it. It's like, a petrol engine that needs petrol. Capitalism needs profit, private profit to drive it. Capital accumulation, as we Marxists used to say, okay? And the other thing is that exploitation takes place in markets. That's the whole point. So exploitation takes place through markets. Money markets, land markets, house markets, labor markets. But now, after 12 years of the 2008 crisis and beyond, we have the replacement of profit by central bank money. That is the new fuel of the system, of this exploitative system, and the steady encroachment into the space of markets of platforms. Amazon. The moment you go into Amazon or Facebook, the moment you enter Facebook, you're outside of capitalism. You're not in capitalism anymore.
Because, explain.
Yeah, you go into Facebook, right? Let's say you want to sell your stuff, to advertise your business in Facebook. You go in, you use your credit card, you pay money to Zuckerberg, and some more people see your advertisements. You go in there to meet your friends. You want to advertise this evening. You go and pay money. One person owns the whole digital space. Everything that is traded in the shops that I see is controlled by one person who decides what prices are charged, what prices are not charged, who can trade, who can't trade, who can buy, who can't buy. What your eyes see is determined by one person, by the algorithm of one person, who, if he wants you not to see something, you will never see it in that digital space. This is not a market. This is a fiefdom. It's a digital fiefdom. It's a platform. Those platforms make a lot of money. And increasingly, everybody is producing capital directly for these fiefdoms. Every time you have your phone and you walk around, Google knows where you are, and that enriches the software of Google Maps. It adds your movements, add capital to Google. You're not a shareholder. You don't get shares for that capital. They get it. These are the reasons why, for me, techno-feudalism is such a menace. And the worst part of it is that when I speak of this, do you know who really loathes my thesis more than anybody else? The left. Because we leftists grew up with this ambition that we would bring capitalism down. And here I am telling them that, you know what? We are out of time. Capitalism has brought itself down. And it's been replaced by something far worse, not by socialism. The left does not want to listen to that. They really loathe that message.
Yep. So Yanis Varoufakis has popularized the term techno-feudalism, and he has boldly claimed that we are no longer in capitalism anymore. It's quite a big statement, and Yanis Varoufakis admits that he has yet to really back this up, and he will make a book next year about this topic. He says it'll be the topic of his next book. Very excited for that. And it has been a topic of discussion among other scholars, such as Nick Srnicek in his book Platform Capitalism, and Is Capital Dead by Mckenzie Wark, all of which we'll be discussing today. But first and foremost, Ed, would you like to introduce yourself as well as your first impressions to the Yanis Varoufakis talk with Žižek and the idea of techno-feudalism in general? Just some first impressions.
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, you introduced me well enough there. Uh, so I'll go straight to the impressions, I guess. When I when I first heard it, I think I got to like the 56th second and just sort of spilled my brain onto a page. um, Sort of straight away, even before I think that was only Zizek's question. It didn't even get to Yanis yet. Um, yeah, I mean, I don't even know where to start. I guess, I guess the first thing I would say, because the big question is this the end of capitalism? I would, my impulse is to say no. Um, Actually, when I started the channel, my impulse was to say yes. And a reasoned answer, I would say, probably is it doesn't matter. And I guess we'll get into why or thrash that out through this chat. But the basis of why I wouldn't say it matters whether it's capitalism or not is because of various definitions that sort of float around um, on the term capitalism and what the nuts and bolts of capitalism, or when a Marxist or a socialist or a communist talks about capitalism, what the nuts and bolts are, and how different they've changed, um, which I'm not like hugely convinced that they have. So on one hand, you can say, sure, capitalism is dead, and we're veering towards some sort of neo-feudalism, the platform techno-feudalist idea. But on the other hand, how does that both sort of technically and strategically change things from a Marxist or a socialist perspective?
Yeah, I think there is a tendency in among like scholars, theorists, and in academia to come up with neologisms or provocative terms, that capture attention, like um, like techno-feudalism or neo-feudalism. That was the one that was used before, or cyber capitalism, digital capitalism, data capitalism. There's all these terms people come up with, right? And I understand why. Um, when it comes to Yanis Varoufakis' thesis initially, I get where he's coming from, in the sense that capitalism certainly is not how it used to be. Like it very much has changed. There is something different. Um, the thing where I would disagree is that this isn't capitalism. Although I think his argument specifically about the fiefdoms, the digital fiefdoms, and how Facebook and Google work, I think that's actually convincing. And there's another theorist who wrote a book about this called Platform Capitalism, although he doesn't think this isn't capitalism. He thinks it's just a new form of capitalism, which is more where I lean on, just to straight out the gate. Like, I don't really think we're not in capitalism. I think capitalism has more so changed in new ways, and there's new forms of capital. And I think like the ownership of platforms and why own the means of production directly when you can own the platform where people who own the means of production use? Like, you can own those who own the means of production effectively, right? Like for Amazon's like this too, is Amazon doesn't like it's just a platform where people sell products. The capitalists mainly are the people who own the products, the workers and those who make the products. Amazon profits from that. So it's like almost a new tier of capitalists. Some say it's, maybe like Yanis Varoufakis would argue that this is not really this. These people are more like feudal lords. But the thing, and he says at one point in the speech that when you enter Facebook, right, it's like you're entering a sort of kingdom, and it's like a digital fiefdom. Like you're producing value, right? Like a digital serf, I guess. And Facebook is taking a cut of taking the value you produce indirectly through your you're just using the platform. Like when you use Google Maps, you're adding to the value of Google by giving them more data. And in Facebook and Google, when you give them more data, they can sell that to advertisers who will use that to market you, give you the products. Like you're the product basically. And the thing about that though is he tries to say they're like digital feudal lords, but what this misses is people like Mark Zuckerberg don't own all of Facebook, and I think he knows this. Obviously, like he knows this, but it's vital discussion because really there's the exact same structure of capitalism. Like Facebook, yeah, it might be kind of like a kingdom, and how it extracts value certainly is not in the traditional capitalist way at all. But it's still like Facebook is not owned by one man. It's not a kingdom owned by one man. Something he says in that speech, which is kind of weird because it's not. Like it's a bunch of shareholders, right?
He's just being reductive.
Yeah, of course. And Amazon, obviously, Bezos not even the CEO. There's a new CEO, but it's owned by a bunch of shareholders, right? Some people who never even been at an Amazon warehouse in their life own huge amounts of Amazon stock, right? And they'll benefit from that. And that's nothing new. That's capitalism. But now I want to touch on one other thing. The more thing, we'll come back, I think, to the platforms of like Facebook, because Facebook and Google, I think, are like new in terms of like, I don't think Marx's work can explain Facebook and Google, but I think they can explain Amazon. And I think they can even explain like the whole central bank phenomenon, which is another part of his whole thesis. But Facebook and Google, we'll come back to that because I think that is unique. Like Facebook and Google have a method of like a value extraction that is very alien to traditional capitalism. But he mentioned though that capitalism is in a drip feed, that it's basically relying on central bank money. And he gives the example of how when the London Stock Exchange, like it went up when the news of the GDP going down 20%, which is, and similar thing happened in America. And what's interesting about that is his thesis is the reason why the markets reacted positively to the economy shrinking, which is strange, right? You would think the opposite, is because he thinks that the top like investors, right, are basically expecting the central bankers to panic and quote unquote print lots of money for them to play with and then invest in more stocks. And by printing, I just want to clarify, this is kind of inaccurate too. I think he knows all of this. This thing, he's an economist. He knows this. It's just that he has the Richard Wolff effect, like in the sense that he always tries to simplify things, which is good. But in doing so, he sometimes says stuff that's kind of wrong. And I think he knows it too. It's just he's trying to be reductive, right? But like, yeah, they're not printing money per se. They're more so, yeah, they are like injecting loads of cash in the banks to lower interest rates so that the banks can give out cheap ass credit, which is good for the investors, right? Because they love to take out like debt at 0.01 interest and just fucking buy up stocks. So I think there's some merit to the thesis. The thing is, I don't see how this means that it's not capitalism. All it means is that it's just much more overtly state capitalism. How is that like? I don't know. That's what's interesting to me. I don't. That point's interesting. All that to me is that suggests that capitalism is more in decay and policy making is ever more skewed by like the financial class, and this just means greater financialization. But I don't see how this in any way means that we're not in capitalism. Like I don't get how that whole central bank argument works.
What I alluded to the start of this channel, I'm sure I've said it before elsewhere as well, that I think we just sort of happened on the reading Ellen Meakson's Wood, Origin of Capital, and sort of being exposed to the idea of what like the transition from feudalism to capitalism was. And you're sort of, I think, during or just before the pandemic. I mean, the conditions aren't all that dissimilar. And you just sort of reading about people like Bezos and their experience with Amazon and stuff, and you can't help but make those connections with sort of feudal lords. But we were myself and Ollie at the start of the channel, we were discussing this, and it just sort of like, with no prior exposure to these sort of ideas, just sort of asked naturally, like, is this still capitalism anymore? They're beginning to extract sort of extra economic wealth here, and yeah, you just sort of begs the question. But we went on to read Lenin's Imperialism, and I mean, for 100 years ago, he's pretty much describing the same situation, the transition from productive capitalism, industrial capitalism, to financial capitalism, and the other sort of commonly known theorist, David Harvey, speaks about this transition as well in the during like the 20th century, in terms of the sort of arrival of fictitious capital. And I don't know, it seems that this situation, as described by Lenin, is still capitalism. He describes it as capitalism in decay, and it's where, I don't know, did I use it on your channel already before, with the analogy of like a football competition or any sports competition. You've got like 36 players, and through knockout rounds you get to two, and those two in the latter stage of the competition have their chance of getting their hands on the big prize. And from the free competition of the earlier phase of that competition, sort of describing what Marx saw between 1814 and 1860 of free capitalist competition. And then you're getting to the point where basically two teams or whatever are monopolizing the competition through their mastery of the competition. They're at the later stages. No one else can rival them. One of them is going to get their hands on the prize. And at that stage, they're sort of, well, like I said, they're monopolies, but they're sort of, it's an imperial endeavor. And you sort of, well, what Lenin is saying in that transition, he spotted, or he like tagged it as the transition of the century, from the 19th to the 20th. And you're getting that transition from where industrial capitalists were sort of ruling the roost in that earlier phase. You're getting to a point where they're only sort of operating capital, and actually the owners of capital are the bankers, the financiers. And that brings us back to Harvey, fictitious capital, and a similar replication through the last century, where after the war period and some sort of some balances in relations between capital and labor were reset because of the war, we got like a sort of a synthesized period of free competition, and a whole sort of new, for so many various reasons, a whole sort of new consumer capitalism that led to like a flourishing of brands and new companies vying for market share, and eventually coming to a point where the most successful ones in through competition have sort of cornered their markets. They're beginning to become monopolies. They're buying up competitors. They're buying up would-be competitors, new ventures, and also they are looking for short-term continual returns on their investment. And because of this, they're squeezing, and this happened in the 19th century to the 20th century as well. Otherwise, we wouldn't have the body work we do draw from. This short-termism, for profits, you're sort of like you're veering towards automation a lot. One factor for this, and you're basically sort of squeezing the amount of income, wages that are leading, that are heading to the working class, and you see capitalism eating its own tail. And this is what like Lenin's describing as capitalism in decay. And this is what we've got today, sort of diminishing returns on investment, leading to the need for fictitious capital. And I would say with that parallel in the two histories of those 2 centuries, as a response to Yanis, I would say that there's a shift. So he's using capitalism in terms of this halcyon day sentimentalist view of free competition and free markets. And while it doesn't, what we don't need to believe Lenin. We don't need to say, we don't need to like set up a camp and go, yeah, no, this is capitalism in decay. It's still capitalism. It doesn't matter whether it's capitalism or not. But it has been described before. And what's happened is a shift in the locus. So where in the previous early phase of capitalism, the surplus value is extracted from the productivity of labor. But in the financial situation, how this manifested a century ago is like through colonialism, imperialism, where big powers are vying for land, foreign land, and it's running out. And that's like your market share getting smaller and smaller, especially when there's like GDP is getting lower and lower because the market isn't expanding. You're getting less of a share. The competition is getting more and more fierce. And what we saw a century ago was Germany getting a little bit freaked out by this. Russia, France, its big competitors, got all this land, cornered all these markets, cutting, carving up the world in their spheres of influence, and decided they need to do something about it and tried to carve up Europe for itself, leading to the First World War. So the parallel this time around is you've got mega companies. What looks to Yanis as a sort of stable situation between platforms and fiefdoms in total control is just a moment, I would argue, in intense competition, but a stable moment that eventually will spill over into like a moment of leverage where one will attempt, assuming there's only two, there's more, where one will attempt to buy out the other. But because you get to such a stage where like monopolies are so huge, it and Lenin describes this as well, you get to sort of like alliances between them. But no, I'd argue that this is just sort of a temporary moment, and it could last, I don't know how long, but eventually, you know, there's no reason why Facebook doesn't have Google in its sights, because what we know from capitalism, the tendency in capitalism to be incentivized by competition is that they will assume that Google has Facebook in sights.
So I think what you're saying is basically that what is happening now is merely just a new, different manifestation of monopoly capitalism.
I would think so. Yeah.
I mean, like that. I agree. The thing about Facebook and Google, though, about how they extract value, I think
that's different,
qualitatively different. Like in terms of just like how value is extracted. Like you can, the Marxist model, this doesn't really seem to apply for me like there. But I think when Yanis Varoufakis talks about the dependence on credit and financialization, I think that is really just something that's something already Lenin noticed, right? Because Marx famously was writing about competitive capitalism, because he's Varoufakis, he talks about how capitalism is no longer this competitive, vibrant system, ruthless competition, and okay, yeah, it's not, and it stopped being that way already in the
over the last half century.
Well, I'm debating, was it the late 1800s or the early 1900s? Like,
you mean back then,
yeah, like monopoly capitalism was really already happening in at least the early 1900s. That's why Lenin, right, famously with imperialism in its highest stage of capitalism, one of the characteristics of capitalism now is financialization and imperialism, right? Like that's a big characteristic of it. And when this idea of it not being competitive capitalism anymore. I mean, we've heard this so many times before. Like, I don't think anything of that about that has changed. I mean, when has the last time capitalism was competitive? Like, you think about it, after it crashed in 1929, then it transformed into like this welfare bureaucratic state capitalism, right? Managed
Uh,
capitalism, and it wasn't competitive really. Like, the state picked winners and losers, and even
that's a
after
good point.
neoliberalism, right? And even after neoliberalism, the smashing of the welfare state. Neoliberalism, it's not like they resorted back to laissez-faire capitalism. I mean, it was laissez-faire in that they would let the capitalists do what they want, but they still guided it actually far more than they did in the pre-1929, the classic laissez-faire type of capitalism. It was still very much managed, and the state still had a heavy hand, like especially with the central bank, right, took a very big role. Like, let's look at like Reagan, for example. Reagan, after the 1987 stock market crash, used these central banks to bail out the economy, basically, or bail out the
Mm.
financial sector. Um,
I could be
and
wrong, but I do feel like that, that there were a lot of sort of mega corporations today that might not have been like huge sort of 80 years ago. And that there was sort of, because of the and there's a good point that you make about the sort of state involvement, particularly in terms of sort of like social democracy, and how that influenced things. But like the sort of the renewed burst of consumer markets and the Marshall Plan in Europe, the rebuild in Europe, and all that, just a lot of that money sort of and a new way of life that was that was competing with the Soviets, that that a lot of companies were able to sort of compete in that sort of sandpit context, and end up becoming like sort of fairly huge powerhouses today.
yeah, I think that's one of the main things that changed, right? Is like the industries of capital, the sectors of capital, and that's kind of why like you tend to see politically, in terms of the two main parties in bourgeois countries, especially United States, Britain, Canada. You tend to see the two parties represent old money and new money to a certain extent. Like, you have like these different sectors, like Republicans represent very much old money still, like oil companies, industrialists, and Democrat who want to keep like wages low, who are against climate policy. Democrats tend to represent the Silicon Valley capitalists, big tech, stuff like that. And it's these new sectors of capital, right, that I think are characteristic of this new capitalism. And I would say most of them function like really just like normal capitalist enterprises. Like, one thing Varoufakis also mentions is how with this, I'm going to say, they function like capitalist enterprises with the exception of Facebook and Google, and also you could maybe throw Airbnb and Uber in there, are also kind of strange. But he also mentions Apple, how Apple isn't like a company per se, like in the sense that it doesn't actually make products. It just owns a gazillion companies who make products, and Apple slaps the Apple brand on
Yeah.
it. But that's not new at all. That's just franchising.
Yep.
And like that's McDonald's, right? Like McDonald's always was like for a long time, McDonald's wasn't it was really a real estate company, in the sense that like it extracted rents on the people
Mm-hmm.
who bought McDonald's franchises. So it was like it's not, where as opposed to it directly making products um and whatnot. Rather, people have to pay McDonald's to run a McDonald's business, and they profit off the brand. That's not new at all. And monopolies aren't obviously new. There was plenty of big monopolies. It's just that as capital industry changed, you have you as industry, you have new monopolies, and because there are increasingly big data companies that rely on um, that rely on different ways of gaining value. Like, data is the new oil, people say, right?
Yeah.
uh so that's mainly what's changed. I keep saying we'll get into Facebook and Google later, but I do want to say, with regarding the central bank money, that I don't think was always a characteristic of capitalism, even in the social democratic era. Like, right, like Roosevelt didn't actually bail out the banks in the same way that they do now. Like they built the banks by building the economy first.
Yeah, it's like the two turn of the centuries. I mean, like, because social revolutions don't happen in total senses; they happen in along various multiple strands. And so, whereas like Lenin said that the turn of the last century was quite definitive. Of course, you're already getting in the decades that like precede that the sort of the developments towards that sort of total moment of change. And the same with our turn of the century. The financialization starts sort of kicking in towards the end of the last century and totalizes on the other side of the millennium, the turn of the millennium. Yeah, it didn't exist in the social democratic. I'm agreeing with you there. It didn't exist in the social democratic period, but because that's what I'm arguing is like the synthesized earlier stage of capitalism, the free competition. I know it's synthesized, but what sort of signifies that, or what sort of qualifies it, and makes it sort of like hammers the point home, is the policies that begin gearing the economy towards like total financialization that we begin seeing in the 80s.
Yeah, so this is something I think like a big point of this is financialization has been the sort of process that's been going on for a while. Like that's Lenin writes about that already. But I think the main difference between financialization now and before is deindustrialization.
Mm-hmm.
So that's very characteristic of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism, right, with these policies that were actually very much anti-growth, right? The policies of neoliberalism were destroyed growth. They actually really weakened the economy, and high interest rates, in Thatcher Reagan era specifically, killed a lot of small businesses, create high unemployment, bad all around. But they increased relative power for capitalists and created a larger reserve army of labor that was allowed capitalists to make more profits by shrinking wages and extracting surplus value more through more exploitation, as opposed to relying on greater revenues, which would be more relying on greater growth. And there's many theories as to why they did this. Obviously it's capitalists wanting more power, as they always have. Yeah. Another part of it is because as social democracy and welfare capitalism, right? Because I hesitate to call Britain and USA like social democracy, especially the USA at that time. But there was increasing activism, right? It peaked in the 60s when the economy was doing great. A lot of people had free time, they had good jobs, and they're like, okay, let's maybe they had the ability to dissent, the ability to really quit jobs. And
it was a crisis of democracy was how what's his face described it.
I don't recall. Okay, yeah. And so this is like the neoliberalism was a way to completely smash that, right? Mm-hmm. But the problem that neoliberalism created is shrinking growth and shrinking consumer spending, right? Because people had way less money. And shrinking then what ends up, So, but capitalism, right? It's a contradiction. They want unemployment so that capitalists can have more leverage and pay people as reserve army of labor, yada, yada, right? But it's a contradiction because they also need people to buy their shit that they produce. So they need incomes. So how did they deal with this in the 90s? Cheap credit, right? Like lowering interest rates, the popularization of like Visa and MasterCard, companies like that. Basically like being able to, quote unquote, borrow, use credit, and then pay it off later. And this is good for creditors depending on like the interest rates and whatnot, but good for like capitalism. It's a good way to create a bunch of like fake money and fictitious
capital.
Not really fictitious capital. I think that's more like stocks. No, fictitious capital.
Yeah, but don't you think that that's sort of feeding into it?
Bonds would be fictitious capital. So like if you invest in other people's debt, that would be like fictitious capital. But if you take out debt, like if, for example, you're using credit to pay for things, that's not capital because it's not making you money, but it's making the creditor money.
Fair. I would see that it's a placeholder, but go on.
But so you create all this credit, right? The problem is people invest in things and live in ways that are unsustainable. And first manifested with the dot-com bubble, right, is people investing in all these companies, but when these companies weren't making much profit and there wasn't really much money flowing into the economy, MMT theorists claim that like the budget surpluses that Clinton ran contributed to this, because a budget surplus means less money in the economy, like a bigger private deficit. So like this fuck the economy basically, and it made the crash a lot harder and very hard to rebound. Even after the dot-com crash, the state effectively chose the winners in the tech race. Like they chose Google, they chose Microsoft. And even Amazon did not get big till much later. It took a long time to rebound. And obviously then later came the housing crash, right? That also has to do with like very lax lending policies, because ultimately, why make people wealthier by giving them jobs, giving them good paying jobs and incomes, when you can create a bunch of debt that people rely on, like a big bubble? And so this is like capitalism stalling, and this idea that capitalism is in a drip feed that Yanis Varoufakis says, that is not capitalism. Like that is nothing to do with post-capitalism. That's just a consequence of neoliberalism, I would argue. Like this, what he calls like the system of central banks, like the financial class relying so heavily on central banks. That's just a product of neoliberalism, in my opinion, where the state has essentially reduced its role to that. And really the financial capitalists are relying on this and expecting that. So it's a kind of, it's a difficult system, right? Because they can't simply stop, or else the people who use that credit might hold the economy hostage. And it's a tricky situation. But I think what I'm trying to articulate, like my point is that this is what Yanis Varoufakis is calling techno-feudalism. The part of his argument that focuses on interest rates being low and all this like money being pumped by the system, that is like keeping the capitalist system like a zombie, that's keeping it there running. That is a consequence of neoliberalism and a manifestation of capitalism. I don't think in any way this is non-capitalist, if that makes sense.
Yeah, well, to me, so listening to Yana sort of make the roots of those points, I think this focuses the question on like what's a capitalist and what's a capitalist's interests. What's an economy to a capitalist? What's the purpose of a capitalist economy? And we can have Marx's political critique of political economy, but I think there is. Or I feel, particularly in like when framed between a feudalism and a techno-feudalism, there's a sort of a bigger picture involved in terms of like power. Like an economy is just a way of organizing production, logistics, and consumption. And I'm not sure a capitalist gives a shit. And because they're into the inverted commas economy because for its extractive purposes, and once they squeeze it, they're gonna sort of continue to try to continue doing what they were doing by other means. And was Marx sort of, or are socialists focused just on the question of people extracting wealth in that very like from labor, or are we concerned historically with dynamics of power? Like a rational economy, I would think would sort of log wealth through production, like of say like fixed capital, of sort of machinery, of like if we're looking at automation. A rational economy makes a bunch of stuff that then will go on to make a bunch of stuff. And everyone who made the first lot of stuff don't have to make anything else because the machines are then making them. So they just get to consume. But in a capitalist inverted commas economy, economy, workers are still being driven after the first phase of production. So you've got automation, and you've also got the immiseration of not getting to consume, even though you've made everything that's going to produce everything you're going to need for consumption. So this is the sort of the irrationality, and this is also when we sort of apply Marx's analysis to it, why we can sort of see in that second phase of extraction that as you described, sort of capitalism is the contradiction of capitalism. It's eating itself. It's the profits are sort of just being found sort of wherever, and the central bank intervention of keeping it ticking along. So phases like neoliberalism or imperialism or free flowing capitalism, in terms of like, why do we need to entertain, criticize, agree with, disagree with terms like techno-feudalism as some sort of distinct phase? I think that's the sort of question we've got to be, or for me anyway, got to be answering. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, that's sometimes my position on whether we're in capitalism or not is sort of the quiet, like debating whether the USSR was socialist or not. It's like,
Yeah,
doesn't
exactly.
matter really. Like, it's like, that's not the system we want, and this is not the system we want. So,
Yeah.
but I think Varoufakis provocatively said that the left loathes his thesis, does not like his thesis, because the left's dream was to bring down capitalism, and the capitalism has been brought down instead by Mark Zuckerberg and Bezos and Google. And that's kind of what
Yeah,
his point is. And there is this. I notice in all of our conversations we end up somehow stumbling on accelerationism. But something has to be said that, monopoly capitalism really is accelerationist in the sense that it paves the way for socialism. Lenin himself said this, is that like the monopoly capitalist phase centralizes production, making it ever more easy to transition, right? You, instead of having a gazillion small competitive businesses to expropriate, or even worse, a bunch of peasants, right? In the case of like Tsarist Russia, you have a production that is so heavily centralized and so heavily digitized too, right? Like now you could nationalize the top 500 companies in the US in a heartbeat, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
easy, right? Because of, all the stock is digital, and it's there's what's interesting too is I think Varoufakis, his point is too that I think just because we neoliberalism and capitalism are like the big boogeyman, right? But just because we destroy it or it gets replaced by a new system, that system won't necessarily be better.
Oh, for
It
sure.
could be worse. And what's interesting is there's another book called "Is Capital Dead" by Mckenzie Wark, and it's called "Is Capital Dead, or is it something worse?"
Exactly. Yeah.
And this is an interesting question. I don't know if it's worse. I actually think competitive capitalism was the worst. I still maintain that. Like, this is why I don't like to even act like, oh no, capitalism used to be competitive, because that's like an argument that libertarians, the right-wing libertarians, use, right? That, oh, capitalism used to be so competitive. That's the problem. Isn't capitalism? It's monopolies. It's corporatism. We want small business. That's bullshit. The
Absolutely.
worst time, like the worst. That's why there was so much revolution back in the day. And so much, like, why labor activism was so more militant, because shit was way worse. Why? Who wants to live in industrial capitalism where you're like, you get cancer at age 35 due to working in a factory filled with coal? Like, it's brutal, right? And just generally more competition drives down wages. They talk about how it drives down prices, but it does that by driving down wages.
Exactly.
And that's terrible. No one wants that. I'd rather like look at it this way. Who would you rather work for? Google, Facebook, or small business?
Yeah,
Google,
sure.
right? But the thing is, this is interesting because it brings me right. I thought it was like I almost said Amazon. I thought actually no, Amazon is just as bad, and that's because the way Amazon extracts value and the way Google and Facebook extract value are entirely different. I think Amazon, although it's a platform, it extracts value in pretty much the same way, right? Like how does it get such fast shipping costs? By basically paying people the least amount to do the most possible,
Yeah.
and investing highly in automation too, that's very characteristic of capitalism, right? Like falling rate of profit. It's a big characteristic of that too. And Marx knew this, but Facebook has not that many employees. Like that's what's surprising. It's not so much exploiting its workers for its profit, it's exploiting its users, which is fascinating because what is that? That I actually do think Yanis Varoufakis is right. Like I'll give him credit on that. Like it's a fiefdom more than it is anything. Because you think about the reason why he calls it neo-feudalism, right, is because although it's difficult to talk about feudalism because it varied so much throughout history, but like classic medieval feudalism, right? It's you have the land is owned entirely by the king, and its aristocrats, are an extension of the king, right? The royalty who collect rents, right, and are more so in charge of the land and whatnot, and they're also supposed to like protect the land, and that's how knights get access to the land. Blah blah blah. Well, there's like weird hierarchies in feudalism. Feudalism is weird. There's so many weird hierarchies, but you have how it's extracted basically the peasants just by being there to exist, to live, to get protection. You have to work for free, and it's interesting when you go to Facebook. Like you sign that contract or whatever that no one reads, like the terms of conditions when you make your account, and the idea is like, okay, you can use this Facebook and you want to access the social world, well you have to give us we profit all from your data. So you're creating the value. It is in that way kind of like feudalism. Like I do agree. The thing where I disagree with Varoufakis is that I don't think this is in any way suggests that we're in some new system. Like Facebook and Google are still a very small minority of enterprises. And he also looks at Uber and Airbnb. And Uber and Airbnb, I think, are not feudalist, but they're also interesting because they don't make profits really. They have this weird strategy of running very low costs, losing profits so that they can drive out the competition. And then once there's no competition, they just hike prices, which has been Uber's plan, right? There's a good video on this by the Gravel Institute called Uber is a Scam. And yeah, they're kind of doing this already, like to make profits. They're already hiking rates a little bit, in areas where there's no taxis. So yeah, it's that, but I think that's just capitalism. That's just capitalism with extra steps, if that makes that's a capitalism with extra credit. But Facebook and Google, like, I don't know, what is that? That maybe is like techno-feudalism.
Well, I think none of this can discount a fully qualified return to neo-feudalism. Like the idea that concentrated capital, socialized capital exists or is existing, is continually developing, does give, everyone an opportunity to appropriate it and socialize ownership. That may or may not happen. Climate change may or may not, may most likely totally disturb any sort of developments we can sit here and theoretically outline. Competition may or may not get so fierce that it comes to involve states, and we see another war that disrupts all these developments. But if it happens, what's that? I think that was like 3 alternatives. If a 4th alternative pathway does develop towards an actual feudalism, the seeds are there. Like, I think you've got this endemically wealthy class, capitalist or otherwise, who are increasingly buying up sort of choice real estate across the world, and you could see that then being like exclusively occupied by an elite, walled communities, with the mass of people living on the fringes of these walls, which is also a tendency you see, the increase of urbanization and ghettoization, favelas and the likes, and production, owning the means of production, sort of that just comes to sort of provide produce for direct consumption by that elite. And with whatever degree of automation may exist at that point, I'm sure a few lucky people on the fringes are sort of employed to sort of manage the system. But that doesn't mean that their labor is generating surplus value for extraction. It's just they're just making stuff, and they're giving it. They get a little bit for themselves, but they're giving it to these people within the walled estates. And I think at that stage, that's your sort of your zero growth, minimal, like it's fully deproletarianized, really, situation. That's probably neo-feudalism.
Is it? That's what's interesting. There's a whole school of thought called capitalist power that actually argues that stagnation and like minimal growth is the natural state of capitalism. Ooh. Like in that actually that's the stage of capitalism where the capitalists have optimal relative power over employees.
Oh, that's lovely. And I haven't come across that.
Yeah, that was my last podcast. I did a podcast called Capitalist Power, a New Theory of Capitalism. I don't know if I fully buy it because I haven't read the whole thing, because it's so damn like it's like I need to really dive deep into it. But I interviewed a grad student who's studying that, and he's doing his thesis on that, and really interesting stuff. I'm not sure if I fully buy it, but I need to, dig deeper into it. But it's compelling. I'll say that. And it certainly does explain a lot of what's happening. That while it may look like capitalism isn't capitalism that's dysfunctional, you have this we're approaching increasingly less growth and deindustrialization and whatnot. That actually where a system of less growth is better for capitalists because they have more power.
Exactly.
Well, they might get less revenues, right? Like less purchases. They have more power over their employees because the employees have less employment opportunities.
A dynamic growing economy means challengers come from all angles. So a stable, low growth economy. And this brings it back to the question of what's the interests? What are capitalist interests? They're not interested in an economy. This is my point. They're interested in sort of consolidating power. Exactly.
Yeah, but that's what's interesting, right? Because that's what capitalist power claims Marxism doesn't get. That because in Marxism the focus is on profit, and while it may look like that of course that's usually the thing investors care about. You always look at stocks tend to go up or down individually, right? Because sometimes the whole market goes up or down depending on a wide variety of factors. But individual companies tend to go up and down depending on their earnings reports. But it's not just the profit itself; it's the expectations of the profit, and then what do investors base their expectations of profit off of? Right, the relative profits compared to similar companies.
It's relative, yeah.
Or that company's previous profits, right? Because something interesting happened is I saw this on the news. I pay attention a lot to Financial Times and Wall Street Journal a lot, not because I like their perspectives at all, but it's interesting just to look at it's interesting to look at what the bourgeois are thinking.
Exactly.
And I also watch that guy Steve. Sometimes what's his name? Jim Cramer. He's a stock guy. He's a guy, whatever. He's the if you want to know what's happening in the stock market, he's the guy. And what's interesting, Apple had huge profits, massive profits, and the stock went down. And it's because investors it was lower than their previous profits. I mean, that's falling rate of profit. Marxists will chime in. That's Marx will explain this. But why do capitalists care about profits? Is because it's relative to others, and that means signals relative power too.
Yep. If I found myself in a situation where I was like a capitalist, commanding all these resources, I would fucking want it to stop. I was just like, please, I can't do this anymore. I want to live with my family. I've got enough money, but if I stop, someone's going to take it off of me. And that's the compulsion. That's the sort of, like if you want to look at it in terms of like a virus in humanity, that's the sort of sickness that we're experiencing. And that only stops through monopoly, through imperialism, and through power.
And it's interesting because I think the power itself is like the driving. It's why capitalists choose to extract profits in the ways that they do, right? So like why do they? Because you would think like capitalists support growth that would allow for greater incomes so that they can
no, they're looking at the competitor,
buy more stuff, and then they can get more profits. But in practice, that's not what they support at all, like in the practices. And it seems like, ignorance, right? You always hear like the criticism of a lot of Keynesian economists or Keynesian economists critique modern day economists that they just don't know what they're doing. Their trickle down economics doesn't work, right? That's the idea. But maybe it does work for kind of what they're intending to do. And what's interesting, right, is in Toronto, there's like been an effort to increase housing by like basically drastically lowering taxes and regulations on builder, like real estate companies, these big real estate companies that build properties. But what they've just figured out is, okay, let's actually build less housing and make sure there's less housing being built so that we can have a scarcity and extract every penny out of tenants. So it's instead of allowing for more housing or at the very least more greater incomes so that they could raise the rent, they just prefer to like create scarcity so that they can keep making more with less. And I think a part of that's power, because it's hard to kick out. It's easier to kick out tenants when they have nowhere else to go, right? So, yeah, where does this sort of bring us? Is I think this idea of capitalism being in a drip feed, relying on central bank money, and whether that's an expression of capitalism or not. We can also, this trend, a lot of the trend, interestingly, with central banks playing an ever increasing role in capitalism, actually started in Japan. It's interesting because Japan had a big, economic boom, right? In the 1960s, 70s, and really up till the late 80s had like a big crash, especially in real estate. Like I had a big real estate crash. Ever since then, the central bank has really used quantitative easing. It was actually the first government to, I believe, to use quantitative easing, which is essentially the central bank buying tons of assets, buying tons of debt, and also buying like bonds so that it could in that way inject cash into the commercial banks, so that they could lower interest rates, so that there could be cheap credit. What's interesting is that like this was done early in Japan and it doesn't even work anymore. Like they're still in deflation.
There's an entropy to sort of, I always imagine like if you've got like a dynamic economy, if you've got an industry, and I suppose the last sort of big one was the phone. You've like if you got a wheel that's being run by an engine, the engine is the industry, and the wheel's just going, and the dynamo against the wheel is generating the currency of the economy. Once an industry lags, once the profits are hitting the margin and increasingly smaller, you find that probably not even capitalists, but governments are just they're almost sort of pushing the wheel with a finger, just giving it a shove to just juice a little bit more of the dynamo. That's to me this drip feeding of capitalism to keep it sustained. Cheap credit, piecemeal privatization, because I think there is a social resistance against wholesale privatization. So it's like in the NHS in the UK, it's got to be done by stealth. And Yanis actually mentions that, doesn't he? In that video, something to do with how Facebook is privatizing NHS. I have to look into that. I didn't know what he meant, but I sort of assumed it because that's the tendency, at the moment, just to sort of keep just just like it's not automatic. It's a manual push of the economy to generate like a pulse through.
It's got to the point where in Japan, the Bank of Japan is now the biggest shareholder of the stock market. They own over 400 billion of stocks, like in form of individual stocks and ETFs, like basically index funds, which is insane, right? Like that's crazy. And here's the thing: why, whether this is capitalism or not, I think from a Marxist perspective, and Yanis Varoufakis, although he doesn't really, I wouldn't call him a political Marxist. Like he hasn't really espoused like support for a dictatorship of the proletariat. But he has a Marxist framework in the way he sees economics. Like, so he is like a Marxist economist in that regard. What I think this idea of the central bank and the government playing an ever greater role is it tends to be like a surprise to most people. That is, doesn't make sense because it's ever more reliant on the state. But I think some people say this is not sustainable. I mean, theoretically it is. Like, I think if you look at it from an MMT perspective, how is Japan able to hold such a big share of the stock market? It's in their own currency. The government can, this is quote unquote Warren Mosler's like direct quote for a big MMT economist. The government can buy whatever is for sale in its own currency.
Yep.
Literally. So yeah, it can theoretically can just buy the economy. Like if it's as long as it's in its own currency, sure. And of course, it'll still run into the problem of falling rates of profit, and it can try to delay that through credit or by basic income. But why doesn't it use basic income or create well-paying jobs, even if they're bullshit jobs, right? Like which problem social democracy ran into is creating like some bullshit jobs. Why doesn't it at least do that? Well, I mean, if you have more, whether it be a greater choice of jobs or you have a basic income, this increases the power of workers.
Yep.
And decreases the relative power of capitalists, even if it will be beneficial to capitalist profit. So this is why the state takes such an active role in the economy, but in a way that is not socialist whatsoever. Like, for example, like in the article I just pulled up about Japan's Bank of Japan owning so much of the economy, one of the authors said Japan should stop financial socialism. And I mean, it's not socialism in the slightest sense. Like I mean, this is obvious to us, but it's basically just it's the government's in getting involved in every way possible, but in every way possible that does not hurt the capitalists.
Yeah, I mean, this was one thing that I was critical of for just quickly the way he was talking about sort of governments. I was just like, oh, this is why are you assuming that governments are distinct from capital and not facilitatory historically, that they're sort of one and the same. Our conception of government is for the like the development and proliferation of capitalism, and what freedom of fiscal policy and wealth distribution, what government is that in the interest of? None really that we sort of know of. But I guess the way actually you're talking about it, maybe he's talking about governments in terms of those who are surprised, and is framing it like, oh yes, this is surprising, when actually in fact, yeah, probably he knows very well that actually it doesn't matter.
But yeah, I think the criticism of Varoufakis is that kind of he's doing that old school assumption that the state and markets are somehow separate, which I don't think obviously is true at all. Now I think at this point it should be obvious that some of Yanis's argument is flawed, and to give him the benefit of the doubt, he hasn't really thought this out that much. Like he said it himself, like he's yet to write a book on it. He might in the future. So I think like the central bank stuff, that just more points to like the decay of the system, like that it can't function on its own. That points to its degeneration and decay, and how capitalists are doing everything with the help of the state to increase relative power, even that should be clear by now. But I think now, why not let's focus on the part that's kind of interesting about his thesis, and that is like the digital fiefdom, whether whether the business models of Google, Facebook, and he also mentioned he lumps in Amazon, Airbnb, and Uber there too. But I think Google and Facebook are really unique, and their business models. Like, in what way do these present a sort of new mode of production, if you because what is capitalism, right? Like, in the Marxist sense, is a mode of production, rather than like a system of government. Like liberalism, fascism are systems of government. They're very different, but they're both systems of government that see a capitalist mode of production. Right? Like, for example, China has a Marxist-Leninist form of government, but a capitalist mode of production dominant, right? So if we are going to say we're not in a capitalist society, we have to make the thesis that we're not in a capitalist mode of production. And to what extent, I would say we're definitely in a capitalist mode of production, but to what extent do these companies represent in maybe a economic trend that is post-capitalism? I think that is a more interesting debate. And of course, there's platform capitalism. Nick Srnicek just calls it platform capitalism. But this idea that the way they extract value being not capitalist, I don't know. That's interesting. What do you think about that? Like, in what way do these companies deviate from capitalism, and do all of them deviate from capitalism? Because I think, he lumps in these companies, but I think they're different in different ways. Like, if that makes sense, like Google, Facebook, Amazon, what unites them all is that they're platforms. But what is different about them is that, Uber still generates value in the same way. It's the workers, right? The drivers generate the value. It's not a platform that profits from data, really. And it's more so, I think, what distinguishes it is just that it relies on not making profits for so long, only to drive out competition, which is, you see this with a lot of companies, actually. Sometimes with monopolies, you see this with Amazon too, basically. Didn't make profits for quite a while. But in terms of like mode of production, like, do these companies, these platform companies, which one of them have capitalist mode of production, which ones don't? Because I think that's when we get into like the real idea of techno-feudalism.
I think the first point to address is the way he describes them as encroaching on market space and filling up that space. What you alluded to, the sort of weird way he framed it as the ownership of total space by one person. And just to quickly address that, at least, given the sort of the last, I don't know, hour or less of what or more actually what we've been saying, I think that's the elevation of competition from a multitude to a series of monopolies. Market, I don't believe that these platforms have taken up market space, just the same as colonial imperial powers a century ago took up space, but that didn't mean that they controlled their sort of people the same way that information, the same way that Yanis describes that platforms are doing today, in their sort of colonies and at home. And that same level of control and power is still there in both sides of history. And regardless of market space, it didn't stop being capitalism a century ago, and for that reason, I don't think this has stopped it being capitalism today. And I think that sort of addresses the idea of fiefdom as well. I think the way I sort of outlined neo-feudalism as a possibility a minute ago, I think a lot more has to be done before we sort of see fiefdoms where like a social anarchy has sort of like taken befallen the planet, and these sort of like scoundrels living on the edges of glistening walled cities are being protected by, I don't know who, other fiefdoms. It's a bit of the way off. So bring in Oh, I think yeah. Sorry, I'm addressing this before the sort of the value question, because I do think the idea of markets goes hand in hand, linking the earlier argument with the latter argument. Um, yeah, ultimately, I guess I don't think that sort of the shrinking of markets and the expansion of platforms and the powerless of governments are sort of signifying a deviation from capitalism. So I think, what is it? He describes, at least for Facebook, I think that's the sort of quintessential model that he's talking about, isn't it? In terms of direct production, direct value production. Was it Facebook, or like I suppose Google also?
So yeah, with Facebook and Google, the main drivers of value are the users.
Yeah.
And to a certain extent, this includes both the consumers, the watchers, right, whose consumption habits they're marketed to. Like they're given the ads to watch. So like our data is sold to them. And some people have called this data capitalism. Like there's been analysis on this for a while, but it's different because it's who's being exploited here, right? There's the YouTubers who are exploited, obviously. Like we make like something like 70% of our ad revenue is exploited, but it's not like we're making a product or a commodity or anything. We're profiting because people are watching us, because those people are watching us have their data it's sucked by Google, who give it to advertisers and they have to watch it. So like it's interesting who is the exploiter and whatnot. Like and even to a certain extent, the capitalists are also getting exploited by these platforms. Not that I feel bad for them per se, but like let's say a Facebook Marketplace, to or Amazon more obviously, right? Like to be, if you're a small business owner, sometimes you rely on Amazon or you'll rely on Google Ads, and to a certain extent they'll exploit like they're an intermediary that exploits also the bourgeoisie, I guess. And to what extent are they just these like people like Mark Zuckerberg and the CEO of Google and their shareholders? To what extent are they capitalists? To what extent is Facebook, Google capitalists, or to what extent are they a new ruling class? Because if you think about it, right, in feudalism, there were multiple ruling classes over the peasants. There was not just the king, obviously, there was the aristocracy, and then there were the knights. The knights protected the serfs. They also protected the aristocrats, and in exchange, they were given land, essentially, they became landlords that way, And so you had like a hierarchy that was there's multiple levels to that hierarchy. To what extent is like, because the classic idea of capitalism is that in the Marxist sense is that there's a bourgeois and a proletariat. It sounds simple, but really like the only classes in between there is that there's a petty bourgeoisie and a bourgeoisie. But the reason why Marx is reductive in that way is because they're still the same in that how their relations to the production, right? Is that their main way of getting wealth is through the exploitation of surplus value. But what's weird about platforms is they're part of the capitalist hierarchy, but they're exploiting other exploiters, and in a very different way. So like could it be neo-feudalism? And this is also, I think, what's been a renewed discussion is too, that you've heard about the whole metaverse stuff, right? With Zuckerberg, is this idea of a creation of like a virtual world where you go there, you live in this virtual world, you build like a online life there. You can even buy real estate in the metaverse. You can start businesses in the metaverse, sell to other people in the metaverse. But who owns the metaverse is Facebook. So it's, how is that even capitalist at that point? That kind of, I can see why it's not feudalist because it's owned by one man, but it's owned by essentially Facebook in this case. The royalty, right?
Exactly. Imagine if it was a unit. I mean, how much of the economy does this encompass, and what's sustaining it? And does my earlier argument not sort of kick in that the locus of capitalism has shifted this a second time around from the sort of from that grassroots of capitalism, if you want, up to a higher level. Is the competition in capitalism still latent between these fiefdoms? And I guess like in feudalism, you've got competition between land barons, I'm sure, as well. But in terms of, I mean, the nuts and bolts that I addressed at the very start of this was the nuts being the means of production, and the bolts being like exposure to the market. And with so much of the capitalist economy still in a fairly like a modernist traditional and very commas phase, are we are we who are we? We're the
Our
deproletarian,
postmodernist.
with the deproletarianized postmodern consumer, I suppose. Are we free from the market? I mean, these platforms are sort of providing their own niches currently for us to consume and give over our sort of our weird neo value producing habits. But I don't know. I don't think the market in a higher sense is complete, has run its course. And I think if what's interesting about where we are, like where I struggled to sort of define what we are today, where we are today, if you sort of look back a century ago or a little bit less, to the sort of to those intellectual roots of neoliberalism and the is it the ordoliberal Rupke, who was sort of in his offering to save capitalism from itself, spoke about the need to well, a lot of them spoke about the need to deproletarianize, but he was going so far as to suggest that we needed to be given people, the working class, needed to be given the means of production, which is like fairly wild, like to save capitalism, to literally return to some sort of pre-capitalist feudal social arrangement. And you're sort of like,
Whoa, what? So what?
Yeah.
Save capitalism through socialism.
I'll get you that. Well, I mean, they were German, they're I guess their heart was in the right place. I'll get you that quote if you've not come across it before. But
I mean, isn't that Corbyn's plan, kind of like that, like businesses that break down, the capital, the owner has to give the workers the option to buy the
them out.
enterprise.
Yeah. And I mean, I think like in Corbyn's vision, I'm sure that it was like a step in a development. Whichever, yeah. I mean, the point is, it's like neoliberalism comes along and you go like, fuck, where's our means of production, you bastards? We are like fully exposed to the market. But then you realize, oh yeah, we're not exactly. And obviously I'm talking very specific we here. We in the West, by and large, this developing sort of digitized, educated, computerized, free giving of direct value production over to these platforms. We're not working class. We are given over the means of production in terms of degrees, in terms of computers. They're there, but they're still exposed to the market. We're still there's no respite, there's no harbor, there's no haven where we can etch out a means of subsistence away from the market. And I think that's still what matters, and that's still the mission. I said at the very start, the mission is still very much the sort of the same, is to end that social relation.
Yeah, I don't know if that's as related to what I was gonna say, but what I would say, I do want to, before we wrap up, I want to add 2 points that I kind of forgot to elaborate on, and that is regarding Mckenzie Wark's book, Is Capital Dead? So just to maybe elucidate what she argues, She talks about a hacker class and a victorialist class, which are two characteristics of this, the new development in capitalism or post-capitalism, depending on how one wants to interpret it. And the victorialist class is sort of what she would describe Facebook as, and Google, which is basically they own the vectors of communication, which are like the platforms. They own the infrastructure that structures our everyday life now. We rely on Facebook, we rely on Google, and they own that, and thus they're able to extract fiefdoms from like the users that rely on it. And part of this, what this means is, why own the means of production when you can own those who own the means of production?
Mm-hmm.
Right. And she says how there's examples of this even in traditional capitalist companies. Like, for example, Rolls-Royce will sell engines in a way that you have to use Rolls-Royce's engineers, and you have to pay a certain fee. Um, I think also other companies like what's that plane company that's really big? Boeing also sells like intellectual
But I mean,
property
this was
rights.
Lenin's argument as well, that like the
Yeah, I mean,
financiers.
this is franchising. I mean, I would more say it's franchising, like the intellectual property. Like, for example, by it's really a form of rentism, like this
Yeah,
intellectual property franchising. It's rentism, and I talked about that in Planet of the Robots. Like, I see that as just also, very compatible with capitalism.
yeah.
Even though people hear rent, they think, landlords, they think of aristocrats.
There were slaves in capitalism.
Feudaloids. Yeah, so
Slavery is.
this is an excellent point. Right? You said there's actually a whole essay by David Graeber about like modes of production, and he questions our whole idea of this modes of production, because it implies a teleological view of history that sees modes of production gradually transforming into new ones, and we can see remnants of like the older modes of production
Yeah.
in new modes of production. Like,
As I meant
we
a
can,
while ago, the different strands, the social revolution happens along a multitude of different strands at various rates. So you're going to see
right.
a bit of the future in sort of one element of society and a bit of the past in the other.
Yeah, it's very possible for old modes of production to
But it was so crucial
like
to
like
capitalism as well.
slate yeah, well, slate that's the irony, right? Is slate There's a book about that by Eric Williams called Capitalism and Slavery. Capitalism played a huge role in slavery played a huge role in the development of capitalism, especially in Britain, the USA, and France's slave colonies. Also, it's played a huge role. It's like and you think these are diametrically opposed, and they're not. And and you can see like also like little fusions today. Like, for example, what about like Qatar and the UAE, right? And Saudi Arabia. Are they feudalist countries? I mean, they have a feudalist structure, right? They have like a king and a royalty, but their mode of production is, if you look at it, kind of capitalist.
Yep.
You still have like the way most businesses function. So it's hard once like any sort of mode of production goes global.
Yeah.
It's hard for it to be avoided anywhere.
Yeah.
It kind of spreads everywhere, but remnants of other modes of production can be there. So
but also you're talking about the past in terms of remnants, but also, and this is what I meant, this is the point I'm arguing, that like this platformism is perhaps a glimpse at a feudalish future, but I don't think it warrants the tag currently, because of considering, as you're describing, what the remnants of the past, of very commas here today, is still overwhelmingly the case. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and
that was probably phrased terribly.
Yeah, it's been hard to phrase all of this.
Yeah.
but I mean, perhaps like this, what we're seeing, this development with platform capitalism, or more specifically with these unique forms of value extraction, and what Mckenzie Wark called the victorialist class, of people who own the means of production. They own the vectors of communication, the platforms, the infrastructure, and intellectual property. to the extent that this is a new development, it can coexist with capitalism. We don't have to call it
Exactly.
techno-feudalism or whatever. And the
Would you,
reason why
go on, sorry.
I'm also will say one more thing. The reason why I'm also just, unless there's something very much different from capitalism and Marx was totally irrelevant, I am very uncomfortable to suggest that we're past capitalism and that we're in techno-feudalism, because it's so politically convenient for libertarians and right capitalists to say, oh no, the problem is not capitalism. We're not even in capitalism. What do you mean you're anti-capitalist, silly socialist? Like or it'll make old orders seem more appealing than they actually are.
Yeah.
And that's why I'm very skeptical of attempts to say that we're a new system.
We've gone past, yeah.
And the most thing I would suggest that we're just in a new evolution of neoliberalism.
That's sort of what I'm getting towards. Yeah.
There's some people, I remember even Novara Media was trying to say that because of the COVID bailouts and the massive deficit spending and all of that is neoliberalism over, because neoliberalism tends to promote austerity, and austerity is not practiced as much. Well, first of all, that aged terribly because Biden's now trying to balance the budget. Total insanity. So that's wrong, first of all. But to the extent that crazy spending can coexist with capitalism, and there's the economist Grace Blakely, she argues it's called privatized Keynesianism. And I like that term because it's a way to use Keynesianism, but in ways that benefit capitalist power and not labor power.
That's a good one.
So I think it's just really neoliberalism. We just have neoliberalism dragging on like a zombie.
That's what I was getting at with the Rupke vision. Let's sketch out a typical nuts and bolts of someone who is providing a continual stream of content for these platforms. Like they're going to a cafe in the morning to earn wages, to then go to a supermarket and probably then back to just a different cafe to consume. And the political economy of a platform is a million. I mean, I'm not saying it doesn't impact. It doesn't in the systemic way somewhere, but the political economy doesn't impact in the immediate sense on this person. They're just using the platform on their phone. They're sort of their social economy, because they have no political power. So it's not a political economy. Their social economy is this sort of cyclical, consumptive, productive process, which is, if you want to put it in Marxist terms, it's not the factory worker, but it's akin to the boat captain, the logistics, the fire engine, the sectors of society that aren't necessarily producing commodities, but are producing social services and consuming those commodities. That's still very much a part of these people's lives. And as Yanis says, when he's making the point about the personal sovereignty promised by liberal democracy is collapsing into this, the digital profile. He says they're selling themselves, and this is to strengthen your point. This is sort of neoliberalism, etching on. We're still fully at the behest of the marketplace to continue surviving. We're selling ourselves. These platforms, what they mean to us, LinkedIn, we're selling ourselves on that. We're selling ourselves on Facebook. We are Rupke's or any of those early neoliberal, deproletarianized, entrepreneurial. We're like, the means of production are supposed to be in our hands. We're supposed to be fashioning our own economic destiny, our own economic place, and our economic future out of these.
That was another thing you mentioned. Right? Is how today, the young people aren't really offered the. It's not. He says young people. It's applicable to like a lot of people that
50
they're not
down.
off. That they're like increasingly having to sell themselves on
Yep.
platforms like LinkedIn and Facebook, always advertising themselves and quote unquote take courses that he thinks are rubbish,
Exactly.
so that they can. That's so true, man. Like,
Oh
oh
yeah.
my god. You know, it really feels like when I was in university, like in my undergrad, it really felt like a lot of the people there uh, it's not till you get to grad school you actually see people that want to be there. Like in undergrad, there's a lot of people who just aren't there. They're there to like take notes and
Yep.
pass an A and put something on the resume. And they're kind of programmed this way by neoliberalism to always sell themselves. And there's these platforms like LinkedIn, Facebook that profit off of that data and profit off of that reliance to advertise oneself. But rather than this being emblematic of a new mode of production, I think
It's
it's
still
just reflective
capitalism.
of neoliberalism,
Yeah.
right? Specifically because like why do people have
Market
to sell
competition.
themselves so much? Is because workers have to compete increasingly more for jobs. Like you are lucky if you're offered a job now.
And also this is a
It's like,
fraction of the labor market globally,
yes,
which
yes.
is still crucial.
Yeah, and also because the nature of labor itself, right? It's service work.
Yeah.
So much that relies on a lot of emotional labor, putting that happy smile on. It's I don't know, it's really freaky, and I hate. Yeah, I absolutely hate LinkedIn. I've never made a LinkedIn and I never plan to, but I see people who do it and I hate it. Oh my god.
Oh yeah.
It sucks. It's terrible. Oh my god. It's Byung-Chul Han writes about it in the Transparency Society. Like it is a kind of digital panopticon where you're like of surveillance, but it's the people who have to voluntarily, they are the panopticon. They build at each other. It's a totally wicked system, but I think, yeah, of course, it's also a product. And to tie this into what I've been exploring, capitalist power, putting workers in a position where they have to constantly be selling themselves, selling their social capital, is very beneficial to capitalists.
Yeah. Oh,
It's
yeah.
even if
we're mini capitalists who will be crushed by the institutional power, the establishment.
So Yanis
We're financialized.
So
Sorry,
I guess you could just call it techno neoliberalism. I guess why techno-feudalism? I don't know this debate. Like I find it a neologism, unless he writes a very convincing book. I won't be that convinced. Like I'll call it platform capitalism, whatever. But all of this is to me like just a reflection of the neoliberalism, which interestingly enough, capitalist power argues is the natural state of capitalism.
Yeah, I loved that point. He said that. Oh, go on.
Yeah, so like it's hard to see if I'm going to make a video on this because this is when I was looking into this. When I first heard the lecture, I'm like, this is compelling, and it's often good for views too to like have videos. Of, is capitalism dead? Like I know that video probably could get like views and do well.
Oh, that's what I was going to touch on. He says it's too late. It's capitalism's brought itself down. The left or whatever, and it's like, but it hasn't. That point.
I found the more I looked into it, the more I thought about it. I was like, this doesn't make sense. And if I want to make a video, I want to make a point. And do I want to like? Why is it in my interest to persuade people we're not in capitalism? Like I feel like this gives ammunition to the libertarians who wanna say, who want to create a romanticism for competitive capitalism or some shit. So I don't. If I want to do it, if I were to make a video on it, I would mainly throw the ideas out there and let the audience think what they think. But it's like usually with my videos, I like to make like a big point, and it's been hard to write that script. I might abort mission, not gonna lie, because it's
the way you describe the
pieces to make.
The way you're describing that libertarian view of the halcyon, the sentimental capitalism. To be quite honest with you, I think that is the working definition that Yanis is using. That's what I felt when he says capitalism. That same vision when he's talking about capitalism here, he's not talking about capitalism in its higher stage. He's not talking about capitalism in decay. He's not talking about imperial capitalism. He's not talking about monopoly capitalism. He like, by definition, he cuts the definition of capitalism down to that earlier phase, to that earlier stage, that free competition, that sentimental view of capitalism.
Hmm.
And I think that's a deep error.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, and also another reason why I'm reluctant to make that video is because I don't want to spend that much time like in a video shitting on Varoufakis, because I like Yanis Varoufakis. Like I like him as a thinker, and I like his recently started his novel called Another Now.
Oh, I haven't.
Have you heard about it?
It's a novel.
It's like a fiction novel, and it's about a post-capitalist society. It's like, apparently it's like sort of utopian literature, I guess, where he talks about like what an alternative to socialism likes, and that what alternative to capitalism could be like a 21st century socialism that learns from the failures.
I was just going to say, I wouldn't be surprised if it was an alternative to socialism as well.
Well, an alternative to Soviet socialism for sure.
Yeah, exactly.
But it's I like what he's doing. Like, I think that's a good thing. So, and I also want to have him on the show at some point. Like, that would be really cool to have Yanis Varoufakis on One Dime Radio. But yeah, so I don't know, should I make this video or not? Like, I want to, because I spent so, like, I read these two damn books, like these fucking Is Capital Dead and Platform Capitalism. But then I came to it, I'm like, all I think is just we're just in a shittier, like a new kind of neoliberalism.
But that's valuable, man. Interrogating cross section the three sources and make that point.
Yeah, I could build it up. Like, I could just not reveal my thesis. I could say, are we in non-capitalism? Find out to the end of the video. And at the end of the video, I'm like, psych. Actually, nothing's different. It's all the same.
I don't know. I think the stuff we've gone over isn't so well known, and I think having a sort of a more condensed, punchier version of that sort of narrative of the way people envision neoliberalism, there's so much nuance that people are yet to catch up on with it, and sort of making that, just sort of expressing the different shades of what's going on. I think there's a value to that.
Yeah, and I think the reason why it's just not well known to many people, like many leftists even, is because I think there's not a well-known idea of what, like, people are very confused still to this day about what neoliberalism actually is. Like, I think still to this day, a lot of people associate neoliberalism with what its rhetoric purported to be, like small government and competitive free markets. But like, we know that's not true. We know it's actually in practice a super bureaucratic system where the state plays a bigger role, right? Just in a different role,
different focus.
Rather than kind of conceding to labor, it actually crushes labor power
fully.
And it gives power to capitalists. So it's I think when understanding that, I can understand why Varoufakis' thesis is problematized. And I understand him. He's because he's been in economics departments where he's ran into a lot of like stupid neoclassical people that he probably hates. So I think, if you run into these econ types, they tend to support like the utopian idea of what neoliberalism purported to be. Rarely will you find economists who actually claim to be neoliberal. They usually call themselves like, they're for free market, or they're pragmatic, or whatever, like third way. There's different ways to categorize it, but in practice, if you look at neoliberalism for what it is, it's not all that surprising that we've seen the changes that we have, and I don't think any of them deviate from capitalism. I think with that, on that note, I think we fleshed this out pretty well. I don't know if you have any concluding thoughts.
No, that was good.
I think we're good for now. It's a pretty solid podcast. But for the listeners, if I'd be curious to hear your thoughts, if you think we're still in capitalism or not, so what do you think about the techno-feudalism thesis more generally, or things maybe we missed? Feel free to comment below, and wherever you're listening to this, feel free to give the podcast a rating. and comment your thoughts. But yeah, it's been One Dime and Ed from A New Conversation. Peace out.
Have a good day.